They called me a failure, and for a long time I believed them. Believed them when my father stopped returning my calls and his silence became heavier than anything he had ever said out loud. Believed them when the woman I loved mailed back my engagement ring inside a plain white envelope with no note and no explanation and nothing at all except the ring itself, sitting at the bottom of that envelope like a small, cold judgment. Believed them every single winter when the Christmas cards arrived from old classmates showing enormous homes and smiling families and vacations taken in places I had only ever seen in magazines. And I would stand there, in whatever small rented room I was living in that year, in whatever forgotten town had given me work that season, holding those cards longer than I should have, turning them over in my hands and asking myself the same question so many times it wore a groove into the center of my chest, the way a river wears a groove into stone. Asking myself, did I ruin my life? Did I throw away the only real chance a man from Pittsburgh with no connections and no inherited money would ever get? Did I break something that could never be put back together? And for years, for long, difficult years, I did not have a clean answer to give myself. Only the sound of my own doubt echoing back at me in the quiet of rooms that belonged to other people. My name is Walter Boone, and I am 85 years old, and I live in a dented silver camper trailer parked in Lot 47 behind a truck stop diner called Rosie's on the edge of Tucson, Arizona. And my roof leaks when it rains, and my old Ford pickup coughs black smoke every morning before it agrees to start, and I own almost nothing the world considers worth counting. And I want to tell you something that took me the better part of 60 years to understand completely. Something I wish with my whole heart that someone had sat me down and spoken plainly when I was young and frightened and working so hard to become somebody else's idea of a man worth respecting. And what I want to tell you is this: your life belongs to you, not to your father's sacrifices, not to your mother's fears, not to a corporation, not to a number in a savings account, not to the judgment of people who will not remember your name a generation after you are gone. It belongs to you, entirely and completely and without condition. And the morning you understand that all the way down to the floor of your chest, everything, and I mean absolutely everything, begins to change. My father's name was Harold Boone, and he was the kind of man they do not manufacture in large quantities anymore. Quiet and enormous in his dignity, with hands so calloused from 30 years on the floor of a Pittsburgh steel factory that when he shook your hand, it felt like gripping warm stone. And he never complained, not once in all the years I watched him. He simply rose before the sun every single morning and went to that factory and gave it the strongest hours of his strongest years without ever asking the factory to love him back. And he did this not for himself, but for me, so that his son would walk into a different kind of building someday and matter in a way that Harold Boone never got the opportunity to matter. And when I earned the scholarship to Columbia Business School in 1964, my father sat at the kitchen table that evening and cried, silently, just 2 tears moving slowly down the side of his weathered face while he stared at that letter. And he did not wipe them away. He simply nodded the way men from his generation nodded when the moment was too large for words. And I would have done anything at all to honor that nod. I would have built a wall around that kitchen table moment with my bare hands and lived inside it forever if I could have. And that desire to protect his dream for me became the thing I carried into Manhattan that autumn like a coat that fit perfectly, but was always slightly too heavy for the weather. The city hit me the way cities hit young men from small places, like a wave. Like noise and light and motion arriving from every direction at once. And I wore my best suit pressed 3 times by my mother before I left, and I walked into the lobby of a financial firm on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper and told myself this was the beginning. This was the moment Harold Boone's 30 years of breathing metal dust started to mean something. and the lobby floors were polished so bright you could see your own reflection looking up at you from the marble. And men in suits that cost more than my father made in 2 months moved through the corridors with the tight, urgent energy of people who had stopped questioning long ago whether any of this was worth the asking price. And nobody smiled unless a client was present, and nobody moved at any pace that could be called human. And the air inside that building felt different from regular air, thinner somehow, rationed, like there was just barely enough of it to go around if everyone agreed not to breathe too deeply. On my 3rd morning, I stepped into an elevator beside a senior executive named Mr. Calloway, a man of perhaps 50 years who the decades had not treated with any particular kindness. His face the color of old ash, the skin beneath his eyes hanging heavy with the specific exhaustion that no amount of sleep repairs because it lives below the surface of the body in a place rest cannot reach. And his wedding ring was gone, just a pale circle on his finger marking where it used to be. And his hands trembled slightly while he scanned the morning reports with eyes that moved across the page without truly landing on anything. And then, without a single sound of warning, he grabbed the front of his own jacket with both fists, and the papers fell, and his briefcase hit the marble floor like a gunshot, and he went down. And the sound his body made on that floor was a sound I carried inside me for the next 60 years, and will carry until my last breath. And while we waited in the corridor outside for help to arrive, 2 young associates stood near the window speaking to each other in voices so quiet and so casual they might have been discussing where to take lunch. And one of them said simply, "Call legal." Not, "Will he survive?" Not, "Does he have a family we should contact?" Not, "God, that poor man." Just, "Call legal." As though the most urgent thing about Mr. Calloway in that moment was the paperwork his collapse was settling, going to generate, rather than the life that was draining out of him on a polished floor far from anyone who loved him. That night, I sat alone in my small apartment and looked out at the Manhattan skyline burning with 10,000 lighted windows, and I thought about all the people behind all those windows. And I understood for the first time what every single one of them had silently agreed to, what I had been standing on the edge of agreeing to myself without anyone ever putting it into honest language. And the agreement said, "Give us now. Give us your mornings when your mind is clearest and your body is strongest and your children are small and your parents are still alive. Give us your evenings and your weekends and your health and your attention and your peace of mind. Give us every year when you might have been paying attention to your actual life. Give us all of it, and we will give you money and status and a title on a business card and the approval of people who do not love you. And then, when you are used up and trembling and your ring is gone and your hands shake in elevators, we will call legal before the ambulance arrives." I did not sleep that night. And at sunrise, I packed one bag and left my watch on the kitchen counter because it had been a gift from the firm and belonged to that life and not to mine. And I walked out, and I did not go back. And what followed was the loneliest stretch of my existence. And I want to be honest about that because I think people tell stories like mine and they skip the part where it genuinely breaks you. My father did not speak to me for 2 years, and those 2 years of silence from the man whose tears over a scholarship letter had been the most sacred thing I had ever witnessed were 2 of the hardest years I have ever lived. And my mother called me selfish so many times the word eventually lost its meaning entirely. And Claire, the warm and steady woman I had planned to build a life beside, sent the ring back in that plain envelope. And I sat on the floor of a rented room in New Mexico, holding that envelope for a long time before I opened it. And when I finally did, there was nothing inside except the ring. No note, no anger, no explanation, just absence. And somehow, the absence was the heaviest thing of all. Heavier than anger would have been. Heavier than anything written words could have made it. I washed dishes in New Mexico for $1.25 an hour, and pumped gas in West Texas, and worked construction in Nevada, and fished the Louisiana docks in summer heat that pressed down on you like a warm hand. And I slept in my truck twice during a hard Oklahoma winter when the money ran completely dry and the wind came under the door of that cab like it had made a personal decision to find me. And slowly, so slowly, I nearly missed it, the way you nearly missed the precise moment when dawn becomes morning. Something began happening inside me that I had no word for at the time and would spend years learning to name. I was waking up not to ambition, not to productivity, not to any version of becoming somebody, but to the world itself, to the actual texture and temperature and sound of being a living human being on an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday. And I noticed how rain talked against a tin trailer roof in Oklahoma. And I noticed old men laughing in Texas barbershops with all the unhurried ease of people who had made peace with time. And I noticed lonely widows in diners who ordered one coffee and sat for 2 hours, not because they were thirsty, but because they needed one person to look at them and ask genuinely how their day was going. And I noticed sunsets. God, I noticed sunsets the way no busy man has ever had the stillness to truly see them. The way the light comes apart over the Arizona desert in long, slow layers of copper and rose and deep burning gold. And how if you sit quietly enough, it stops feeling like something you are watching and starts feeling like something that is speaking directly to you. I learned harmonica from a retired mechanic named Curtis in Louisiana who had the most naturally joyful spirit of any human being I have encountered in 85 years of living. And Curtis taught me that music was simply organized grief given somewhere beautiful to go. And we would sit on his porch in the long evenings playing badly and laughing at ourselves and watching the fireflies rise over the grass. And I would think clearly and without any doubt at all, this is what a rich evening feels like. This is what wealth actually is when you remove everything from it that was never real to begin with. One winter the telephone rang and a voice I barely recognized told me Daniel Mercer had died, 51 years old, heart attack. And Daniel had been my college roommate, the most brilliant and driven person I knew at 22, a man who walked into any room and owned it without appearing to try, who built an enormous career and a name that appeared in newspapers, and a house that photographed beautifully, and a life that looked from every external angle like the complete fulfillment of everything America promises its most ambitious sons. And I flew to Chicago in my thrift store black suit and sat in a vast, cold church filled with hundreds of people who had known Daniel in various professional capacities and listened to speeches about his vision and his accomplishments and the deals he had made and the companies he had shaped. And all of it was true, and all of it was not enough. Because in the front pew sat Daniel's teenage son, and he was crying the way a child cries when they miss someone. He was crying the harder, more desperate way a person cries when they realize that what they needed most in the world existed right beside them for their entire childhood and was somehow, always, not quite available. And a woman in the pew behind me whispered to her husband, "Poor boy, Daniel was always working, always working." And I walked out of that church into a Chicago winter and stood on the frozen sidewalk while men in expensive coats rushed past with phones against their ears. And I felt, standing there in the cold, for the first time in nearly 30 years, no shame. At all. None. Because I finally understood completely what I had actually escaped. Not poverty, not obscurity, but the specific and quiet devastation of arriving at the end of your life and discovering that all the years you believed you were building something, you were really just spending time. And time, unlike money, does not come back to you. There was a young woman named Emily who worked evenings at Rosie's Diner. 26 years old, with tired eyes and a kindness she kept giving away to everyone around her while running quietly out of it herself. And one evening, she sat beside me on the back step after her shift and cried softly into a styrofoam cup and told me she worked 2 jobs and posted cheerful photographs online and tracked her sleep and her calories and her productivity and answered work messages at midnight and still felt every single day like she was losing some invisible competition nobody had ever explained the rules of. And she asked me if I had ever been truly successful. And I looked out at the desert, where the sun was going down over the highway in long, slow layers of copper and gold, and I thought about what that word had meant to me at 23 and what it meant now at 83, and how completely and mercifully different those two meanings were. And I told her, I survived something most people don't. And she asked me what. And I said the belief that you have to earn the right to exist peacefully before you are allowed to rest. And she wiped her eyes and asked me what if people think I wasted my life. And I looked at her the way I wished someone had looked at me when I was her age and frightened and running in every direction except inward. And I said, honey, people will call you a failure the moment they can no longer use your fear to keep you moving in their direction. And we sat together until the desert went fully dark and the stars came out the way they only come out far enough from city lights to be completely honest. And it was one of the finest evenings of my long and wandering and genuinely happy life. I have no legacy and no building with my name on it and no grandchildren inheriting anything worth counting. And when I go, there will be no newspaper obituary and perhaps 11 people at the service, and I am at complete and total peace with every word of that sentence. Because I woke up every morning for 60 years and the day was mine. Not the corporations, not my father's dream, not the judgment of people who measured my worth against a standard I never agreed to meet. Mine. And I kept a small handwritten note beside my coffee cup that said the only thing I ever needed anyone to know about me. I was never rich, but every single minute of my life belonged to me. And if that is failure, then I failed more beautifully than most men ever. Managed to succeed. And I would do every last wandering, unhurried, beautiful minute of it again without changing a single thing. If something in Walter's story reached you today, something quiet and honest you have been carrying alone for longer than you should have had to carry it, then you are exactly who this channel was made for. So please subscribe to the 11th Hour Last Words and ring that bell, because every single week we sit together and we honor the lives the world forgot to celebrate. The quiet ones. The honest ones, the ones that never made headlines but changed every soul fortunate enough to witness them. And we do it because some of the most important words ever spoken in this country were spoken softly by people no one was famous enough to listen to, until now.